6 June 1944, and captured Antwerp in Belgium on 4 September. This prompted Seyss-Inquart to declare a state of siege, implement an 8 p.m. curfew, and recall German civilians back to Germany. Many German soldiers and Dutch NSB members followed suit. 194 and 3,500 prisoners were deported from Camp Vut. These actions, combined with false rumors that Breda had been liberated, led to Dal Dinsdag, Mad Tuesday, on 5 September, when the civilian population spontaneously celebrated imminent liberation. Also in September, German occupiers destroyed large portions of the port of Rotterdam and sank many ships to make it unusable to Allied forces. Allied forces first entered the Netherlands at Mesch on 12 September, and Maastricht was the first Dutch city to be liberated on 13-14 September. Operation Market Garden, the major Allied invasion, began on 17 September, with the goal of creating a salient from the Belgian border northeast to the German border. Some 35,000 paratroopers were dropped into the Netherlands along the intended salient, with the goal of capturing key bridges across the rivers Meuse, Waal, and Rhine. That day, the Dutch government in exile called for a nationwide railway strike to cripple German troop transport. Some 30,000 railway employees walked off the job, with financial support from London. Germany substituted its own trains and retaliated with a 6-week ban on food transport to the Western Netherlands, but the strike continued until the war's end. Operation Market Garden was a tactical failure, but established a partial salient from the Belgian border through Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and helped liberate much of the Netherlands south and west of the Maas River. Operation Pheasant in October and November made further gains, liberating the province of North Brabant. A subsequent German counterattack against the Nijmegen salient, the island, was defeated in early October. During this time, areas of Zeeland in the south were deliberately flooded by both sides. The Germans evacuated and flooded the island of Schouwen-Duiveland in September to deter invasion, while the Allies bombed the dikes around Walcheren in October to force its defenders back and open the port of Antwerp. Up to 75% of local Zeeland populations were forcibly evacuated during this period. 74. In the east of North Brabant and in Limburg, British and American forces during Operation Aintree managed to defeat the remaining German forces west of the Meuse between late September and early December 1944 by destroying the German bridgehead between the Meuse and the Peel marshes. During the offensive, the only tank battle ever fought on Dutch soil took place at Overloon, the city center of Den Bosch after liberation, November 1944. At the same time, the Allies also advanced into the province of Zeeland. At the start of October 1944, the Germans still occupied Walcheren and dominated the Scheldt estuary and its approaches to the port of Antwerp. The crushing need for the shipping port at Antwerp forced the Battle of the Scheldt, in which 1st Canadian Army fought on both sides of the estuary during the month to clear the waterways. Large battles were fought to clear the Breskens Pocket, Woonstrecht, and the Zuid-Beveland Peninsula of German forces, primarily occupied by reserve Wehrmacht units composed of convalescents, and the medically unfit, dubbed stomach, units for their ulcers, as well as German paratroopers of Battle Group Chill. By 31 October, resistance south of the Scheldt had collapsed, and the Canadian 2nd Infantry Division, British 52nd Lowland Division and 4th Special Service Brigade all made attacks on Walcheren Island. Strong German defenses made a landing very difficult, and the Allies responded by bombing the dikes of Walcheren at Westkapelle, Vlissingen, and Veer to flood the island. Though the Allies had warned residents with pamphlets, 180 inhabitants of Westkapelle died. The coastal guns on Walcheren were silenced in the opening days of November, and the Scheldt battle declared over. No German forces remained intact along the 64 mi, 103 km, path to Antwerp. After the offensive on the Scheldt, Operation Pheasant was launched in conjunction to liberate North Brabant. The offensive, after some resistance, liberated most of region. The cities of Tilburg, 's-Hertogenbosch, Willemstad, and Roosendaal were liberated by British forces. Bergen-op-Zoom was taken by the Canadians, and the Polish 1st Armored Division led by General Maxek liberated the city of Breda without any civilian casualties on 29 October 1944. The operation as a whole also broke the German positions that had defended the region along its canals and rivers. 1944–1945, after securing the shipping route to Antwerp, the Allied army then focused its efforts on the invasion of Germany, ensuring that the North, including some 4.5 million Dutch residents, would remain occupied until near the end of the war, 324, as food and fuel supplies began to run out. From September 1944, trams were the only public transport allowed in the Netherlands. On 9 October, these too came to a halt as the supply of electricity to civilians was permanently stopped. The ongoing seizure of civilian bicycles further crippled the movement of Dutch civilians. By late 1944, Germany had abandoned its conciliatory behavior toward the Dutch people. Anyone suspected of resistance, including anyone found to be armed, was sentenced to death without trial, though their public executions were typically delayed until a corresponding resistance action occurred. Reprisals became increasingly harsh. On 1 October, after an attack on a German car near Putten, the entire male population of the village, 602 men, was transported to concentration camps while 105 homes were burned. See Putten Raid, Hunger Winter Malnourished Dutch Child in the Hague main articles, Dutch Famine of 1944–45, and Operations Manna, Chowhound, and Faust. The failure of Operation Market Garden created a wave of refugees from the battlefield, some 100,000 from Arnhem alone, and ensured that the territory still under German control would endure the winter of 1944–45 with virtually no material support. In response to a general railway strike ordered by the Dutch government in exile near the end of 1944, the Germans cut off all food and fuel shipments to the western provinces in which 4.5 million people lived. The winter in Europe was one of the coldest in 100 years, causing a shortage of water as well as food. The resulting famine is commonly known as the Hunger Winter, literally, Hunger Winter. Trees began to be chopped down en masse for cooking fires, which caused the Germans to close many public parks. Likewise, many abandoned buildings were demolished so their wooden frames could be burned. Hunger journeys, Hungertochten, were common as people roamed the country to scavenge or trade for food. As the end of 1944 approached, supplies had diminished until the only ration cards issued were for £1, 500 grams of bread per person per day. Even this was not always attainable, and residents lined up overnight at bakeries in hopes of bread in the morning. 2352, 2360. By the onset of winter, some 3 million Dutch residents were facing starvation. Fresh water was also hard to obtain. Efforts were made to tow blocks of ice down the rivers into the cities for melting. The famine ultimately caused up to 30,000 casualties of starvation, exhaustion, cold, and disease, and 18,000 people starved to death. After negotiations with the Germans, on 28 January, a Swedish cargo ship bearing food docked in the northern port of Delfzijl, the first formal relief action of the Hunger Winter. But the situation remained grim in most of the country. By the spring of 1945, food kitchens could provide only a few hundred calories per person per day, and the central kitchen in Amsterdam shut down completely at the end of April. At this time, a loaf of bread cost 200 times what it had a year earlier. Widespread relief did not arrive until early May 1945. Bombing of the Bezuidenhout main article. Bombing of the Bezuidenhout on 3 March 1945. The British Royal Air Force mistakenly bombed the densely populated Bezuidenhout neighborhood in the Dutch city of The Hague. The British bomber crews had intended to bomb the Haagsbosch, Forest of The Hague, district, where the Germans had installed V-2 launching facilities that had been used to attack English cities. However, the pilots were issued with the wrong coordinates, so the navigational instruments of the bombers had been set incorrectly. Combined with fog and clouds which obscured their vision, the bombs were instead dropped on the Bezuidenhout residential neighborhood. At the time, the neighborhood was more densely populated than usual with evacuees from The Hague and Wassenaar. 511 residents were killed, and approximately 30,000 were left homeless. The Texel Uprising main article, Georgian Uprising on Texel on the night of 5-6 April. A contingent of Georgian troops, former prisoners of war who had been serving in the Wehrmacht, rose up against the Germans on the occupied island of Texel and killed some 200 soldiers. The Germans gradually retook the island over the next 5 weeks, with violence lasting even after the German surrender, until Canadian forces arrived on 17 May. This made the Texel Uprising one of the last battles of World War II in Europe. Liberation civilians dancing in the square of Eindhoven, the first major town in Netherlands to be liberated. Eindhoven was later bombed by the Luftwaffe. After crossing the Rhine at Wesel and Ries, Canadian, British, and Polish forces entered the Netherlands from the east. The liberation of the North began on 11-12 April 1945, when the 48th Highlanders of Canada crossed the IJssel, enabling the 1st Canadian Army to liberate Arnhem and Apeldoorn. Within a week, Groningen and Friesland in the northeast had been liberated, leaving only the population centers in the Randstad under German control. Dutch resistance fighters wearing distinctive armbands served as impromptu security officers in liberated areas. 307 notable battles during the movement were the Battle of Groningen and the Battle of Otterlo. During Operation Amherst, Allied troops advanced to the North Netherlands. To support the advance of the II Canadian Corps, French paratroopers were dropped into Friesland and Drenthe and were the first Allied troops to reach Friesland. The French successfully captured the crucial Stokersverloot Bridge. The region was successfully liberated shortly after. Dutch civilians waving to Allied bombers during the liberation of the Netherlands in 1945. As the Allied advance continued, German forces permitted further humanitarian relief. Between 29 April and 8 May, Operations Manna, Chowhound, and Faust were undertaken to deliver food to Dutch civilians behind German lines by air and ground. 80 German forces in northwest Europe had already surrendered on 4 May, but Royal Canadian Regiment General Charles Foulkes sought an explicit surrender of remaining forces in the Netherlands. 81, on 5 May, known today as Liberation Day. Generaloberst Johannes Blaskowitz did so at Hotel de Wereld in Wageningen. At that point, only a few of the Wadden Islands in the north were still defended by the Wehrmacht. 29, 314, the final capitulation of Germany occurred 3 days later on 8 May. Some sporadic violence continued throughout the country, with some German troops refusing to surrender. 2806 on 7 May, the day before Canadian forces arrived, a group of German soldiers opened fire on civilians celebrating on Dam Square in Amsterdam, killing 32. The same day, there was a firefight at Amsterdam Central Station. During victory celebrations in Oldenzaal on 8 May, a group of boys exploded leftover German grenades and created an explosion that killed 9 and injured 60 the last German holdouts. About 600 soldiers isolated on the northern island of Schiermonnikoog finally surrendered on 11 June, 83. After being liberated, Dutch citizens began taking the law into their own hands, like in other liberated countries, such as France. Collaborators and Dutch women who had relationships with men of the German occupying force, called Muffenmaiden, were abused and humiliated in public, usually by having their heads shaved and painted orange. Citation needed. Deaths caused by the war. Estimates of deaths resulting from World War II vary, but of a total population of 8.8 million, one source cites 237,300 deaths. The largest number of deaths was 104,000 Jews who died or were killed in German concentration camps. 50,000 people are estimated to have died because of inadequate medical care. 30,000 of 550,000 Dutch men forced to work in Germany died. 23,000 died in air raids by both Germans and Allies. 18,000 died of starvation in the hunger winter. 5,000 Dutch died in prison or concentration camps. 4,500 Dutch soldiers were killed defending the Netherlands during the German invasion. And 2,800 people were executed, including 19 women. In addition to those figures, 10,000 Dutch men fighting for the Germans were killed. Allied soldiers killed in the liberation of the Netherlands from the Germans totaled 50,000. The Hunger Winter was followed by the Swedish Spring, Leif's Lent, and Canadian Summer, Canada's Zomer. 81, almost immediately after liberation, food supplies improved and rations were restored, including coupons for children for new clothing. 34. 3,007 well-fed Canadian soldiers, stocked with chocolate and cigarettes, proved attractive to Dutch women. A popular song at the time was Trees Heeft een Canadees, Trees a Woman's Name, Got a Canadian. The Netherlands began rebuilding in 1945, but basic services were not available for some time, and heavily damaged areas had restricted access to prevent looting. 31. 331 heavily affected cities included Rotterdam, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. Of about 25,000 homes in Arnhem, only 145 remained intact. 84. German prisoners of war were compelled to clear agricultural areas of landmines. Large-scale reconstruction, called Wederopbouw, didn't begin until the Marshall Plan was implemented in 1948 and continued until the mid-1950s. 84,000 of Arbeitsinzat laborers returned home from Germany during 1945 and were variously welcomed home or treated as collaborators. The Landelijke Organisatie, which had previously helped those in hiding, now helped to register onderduikers and return them to their homes within or without the Netherlands. Dutch citizens dug up silver, radios, and other contraband from their hiding places. 2,806, to restore the financial system and root out war profiteers. Dutch bank accounts were temporarily frozen, and new Dutch guilder banknotes were issued, a process called sanitation. 34. 2,904. In the years immediately after the war, Dutch authorities encouraged emigration to countries like the United States, Canada, and Australia. As much as 3.5% of the total Dutch population emigrated during this period. 85. Collaborators following liberation. The NSB was banned. Arthur Seyss-Inquart and Anton Mussert were arrested, convicted of treason, and executed in 1946 along with other occupation leaders. Hans Albin Rotter was captured while in hospital from the resistance ambush at West Hoeve. He was held responsible for the deportation of 110,000 Jews and another 300,000 forced laborers from the Netherlands. Rotter was executed in 1949. Some accused of collaborating with the Germans were lynched or otherwise punished without trial. Up to 6,000 collaborators were initially interned in Amsterdam. However, a great number of these were restored to their positions in government and infrastructure, while active resistance members sometimes found themselves sidelined. 38. 284. Some were proven to have been wrongly arrested and were cleared of charges, sometimes after they had been held in custody for a long period of time. Women who had sex with, befriended, or collaborated with German occupiers, slandered as Muffenhoren or Kraut whores, had their heads publicly shaved. 308 men who had fought with the Germans in the Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS were used to clear minefields and suffered losses accordingly. Others were sentenced by courts for treason. Holocaust aftermath. Many Holocaust survivors returned to their homes to find them occupied by private citizens or public officials. Descendants of the displaced continue to advocate for compensation for the lost property. In addition, Many Dutch Holocaust survivors were spied on or required to pay taxes for the time they were away. The bank balances of Dutch Jews who were killed were still the subject of legal proceedings more than 70 years after the end of the war. Citation needed. In 2017, the Dutch Red Cross offered its deep apologies for its failure to act to protect Jews, Sinti, Roma, and political prisoners during the war after the publication of a study that it had commissioned from the NIOD Institute for War. Holocaust and Genocide Studies, 8990, Territorial Changes 1945 Dutch propaganda poster, depicting maximalist demands for German soil without Germans. The Dutch government initially developed plans to annex part of Germany, the Bakershut Plan, which would substantially increase the country's land area. The German population would be expelled or Dutchified. The plan was dropped after an Allied refusal. 2 small villages were added to the Netherlands in 1949 and returned in 1963. One successfully implemented plan was Operation Black Tulip, the deportation of all holders of German passports from the Netherlands, numbering several thousand. The end of the war also meant the final loss of the Dutch East Indies. After the surrender of the Japanese in the Dutch East Indies, Indonesian nationalists fought a 4-year war of independence against Dutch and at first British Commonwealth forces, which eventually led to the Dutch recognition of the independence of Indonesia under pressure of the United States. Many Dutch and Indonesians then emigrated or returned to the Netherlands. Remembrance, World War II left many lasting effects on Dutch society. On 4 May, the Dutch commemorate those who died during the war and all wars since. Among the living, there are many who still bear the emotional scars of the war from both the first and the second generation. In 2000, the government was still granting 24,000 people an annual compensatory payment, although that also included victims from later wars, such as the Korean War. In January 2020, for the first time, a Dutch government has apologized for the fact that civil servants acted as accomplices to the German occupiers. This has shaken a long-cultivated Netherlands self-image. 91. The National Holocaust Names Memorial in Amsterdam was dedicated by King Willem-Alexander in September 2021.